Welcome, gentle listener. Today we shall enjoy a tale from the recent Arks of Omen campaign. One I think you may not have heard, taken from White Dwarf, 484 to 489. It shows the exploits of one of the Arks of Omen, the Herald of Misery. Yet there are far more details in it than just a bit of a rumble. Can you detect the most important nuggets of law contained within? And if you enjoy this presentation, as simple as it may be, please give it a like and possibly even a share. The algorithm is not very kind these days to long form, so if you enjoy it, support it. And so, welcome to the tale of the Arks of Omen. Herald of Misery, Bitter Ambition, Arks of Omen, Herald of Misery. Abaddon the Despoiler had embarked upon a campaign of acquisition spearheaded by vast vessels known as Arks of Omen. Each of these was a gift to a champion, willing to take up the search for an esoteric prize, desired by the Warhammer master. Amongst the greatest of those who grasped the opportunity was Warpsmith Czagra of the Iron Warriors. The summons of the Despoiler was not one that could be ignored. Abaddon's challenge wormed its way across the galaxy. Demons whispered it through corrupted vox emitters. Sorceress visions were thrust into the fevered dreams of psychers. Warlords hastened to the spoiler's side through ambition, loyalty, or fear. When Abaddon's offer seeped through into the ghoulish subsector, it was sifted from the nightmarish gibberish of the warp by the divinations of a conclave of mechanistic cyber thighs, who served Warpsmith Czagra, the Grand Marshal of Ruin. This lord amongst the Iron Warriors had trodden a year-so-long path of destruction through the subsector's string of Imperial Bastion worlds, and forged moons fortified Xenos blood layers and pirate strongholds. Czagra's methodical destruction of those he'd conquered had long ago become an obsession, where other Chaos Warlords raised blasphemous idols or displayed the gorier remnants of the foe's champions. The Warpsmith made examples of his enemies' every edifice. Though most already lay broken in mountains of cyclopean rubble, Czagra pummeled remnant structures to their deepest foundations with orbital bombardments. Tectonic plates fractured, drowning whatever remained in guises of molten lava. Czagra had come to conclude every such act of meticulous annihilation by searing a vast skull-shaped sigil into the site of his victories, stamping his mark on the defeated world with surgical lance strikes for all to see. When Abaddon's offer reached Czagra, he was inflicting such a cruel fate upon the once formidable fortress world of Narator. The Warpsmith weighed Abaddon's message as he worked. His horde was already mighty, yet an Ark of Omen represented an awesome potential for greater destruction. With glacial inevitability, Czagra's ambitions widened to encompass the power on offer. He envisioned a space-borne fortress the size of a planetoid, laying siege to entire worlds. By the time Warpsmith Czagra departed the ghoulish subsector, making for the coordinates embedded in Abaddon's summons, his fleet numbered dozens of ships, an entire warband sworn or enslaved to his will. At their head, in both favor and power, was Czagra's own warband of Iron Warriors, their faces of mending guard. Brutally efficient siege masters, these warriors had helped their lord destroy and conquer for millennia, The majority were cold-hearted veterans of the Legion's long war, everyone marked by arcane cybernetic augmentations. Exemplifying this trend and acting as Kazaga's axeman and enforcer was a master of executions, Karbal Mandra. His mismatched ocular bionics were said to detect his prey souls and dizzying, empyretic spectre. But the conflicting neuropathic input had sent the champion insane long ago. Few of Kazagra's warriors openly worshipped the Chaos Gods, but individual devotees of each of the ruinous powers were not unknown. The greatest in number were those who killed in the name of Khorne, and they were often the first to storm any breach cracked in enemy defenses. However, while the Warsmith willingly embraced the infernal power that the warped demonic denizens offered, he was adamant that the entities know their place as tools of his will. He did not permit the presence of possessed legionaries in his ranks, and any who fell to the beguilements of demons were gunned down as an example to others who would dare exchange his authority for that of a warp-spawned entity. Many throw bands fought at Kazagra's command. The most numerous amongst his mortal followers were the Riven Reforged, a cult of mechanistic obsessives who idolized their iron warrior masters. They scavenged rusted and broken mechanisms and attached them to their bodies with crude surgeries or wore them as fetishes. Some were bent double by the weight of mostly useless machinery, dark mechanical forces from a number of Traitor Forge worlds had made compacts with Kazagna to provide him with insane warp-rot creations and aeronotechnic viruses. Other warbands of Iron Warriors, such as the Barbcan Lords and their Pharaocratic Creed, had also pledged ritualized oaths to him along with traitor princeps of Laios, Krytos, and Rogel, among others. Warsmith Czagra himself rarely deigned to take the field in the opening moments of his assault, instead preferring to orchestrate his meticulously planned strategies from aboard his flagship, the Forge Maul. When the timing was right for him to make his presence felt in battle, or on rare occasions when those plans went awry and he was forced to intercede, Gaga would lead the attack in person. Cladded in warped Terminator armor, the Warsmith was an imposing and deadly combatant. In one massive gauntlet, he wielded an ancient combat bolter which fired bolts at each caged, tormented spirit. Their detonations read thrumming gist waves of force that crushed enemies and disrupted battle lines. His other arm ended in a complex bronze core of barbed servos talons, wreathed in eldritch weird fire and edged with demon chitin, with which he eviscerated enemy warriors and war engines with ease. The claiming of a monstrosity's fleet translated into real space, and the coordinates given by Avdon's arcane message. Many of his followers were AED and disturbed by the sight that greeted them. Czagra was intrigued. Scores of traitor freed circled each other or bullied their way into favorable positions. Distrust and rancor, visible in their aggressive stances. Spread amongst them were the grossly misshapen silhouettes of many space hulks. Each were surrounded by halos of sickly light, and cradled in impossibly vast spider-like gantries over which swarmed demonic laborers. These vessels were the Arks of Omen, as the Despoiler summons had foretold. The titanic warships waited to be claimed by those who proved strong enough. Their mystery was something Czagra and the other aspiring Arkmasters had to seize for themselves. The vast summoning point the Czarga's fleet entered was both a hive of insane industrial engineering and a dangerous conflict zone. Threats between rival fleets spiraled into outright conflict. Battle also raged around and within several Arks of Omen, as would-be masters fought to yoke the Leviathans to their will. Czarga's fleet barged their way through lesser armadas, leaving the wrecks of dying ships in their wake. It was not long before the vengeful spirit, poised far above the cluttered mustering point, signaled him on the bridge of the Forge Mall. Every picked screen suddenly came alive with an image of Abaddon. Czarga ritually knelt before the looming spoiler, swearing a binding oath and committing himself and his fleet to the bargain. Long moments passed before Abaddon appeared satisfied. He granted permission for Czarga's fleet to continue and transmitted coordinates for the Ark he had assigned to the Warpsmith. Before cutting his signal, Abaddon informed the still kneeling Iron Warrior that the Ark had already consumed 2 eager conquerors. "Let us see," Abaddon said, the ghost of a sneer on his lips, "if you will be the third." In the void, the Herald of Misery awaited its would-be master. The Herald of Misery, the space hulk that would become the Herald of Misery, had been located upon the tides of the warp by the demonic master of the Soul Forges, Vashtor the Arkifane, spared and wrenched into real space by techno-sorceress means. It had been descended upon by the demon demigod and his legions of war-porn thralls, who had molded it to suit its intended purpose. From a distance, the Herald of Misery appeared to be shaped like a gigantic blunt-nosed arrowhead, a brutal wedge of dark iron and rock. On close inspection, it was an amalgamation of thousands of wrecked ships fused together by the power of the warp. Individual vessel fragments over a mile in length encrusted its surface like angular metallic barnacles, in comparison to the hulk's huge mass. At its tapering prow, or at least the opposite end, to where Vashtor had added numerous massive engine ports, the crushed wrecks and detritus were fused with a monolithic slab of asteroidal rock. It was void, hardened, irradiated by long dead suns, and veiled with warp-tainted strata. The Arkifane had incised hateful and mechanistic runes into the rock. They empowered the mass of dense material with a therming empirical resonance that turned it into a ram capable of plowing through Imperial star force and shaking them apart from the inside as it did so. Czagra maneuvered his fleet in a possessive cage-like formation around the Herald of Misery. He had already constructed his strategy to enter the Ark, and he was impatient to set its pieces in motion. Czarga's orders to his fleet were simple. Theirs would be an aggressive defense of the Herald of Misery and the surrounding space. They would drive away rivals for the Ark and prey on nearby ships, enslaving them and their warp bands, or else picking over their wrecks for resources. The Grand Marshal of Ruin had his takeover. With the aid of his cybernetic conclave of mechanistic psychers and masters of forbidden technological law, they assembled multidimensional equations and quantum portents in attempts to define the threats inside the Ark. The Warpsmith's own immense intellect passed thousands of schemes, his thoughts flashing between his own mind and cybernetic, demonic manifestations of flesh and machinery that skewered or flitted in his wake. 3 areas of control were prioritized, the largest of the Arkipane's added engine clusters. the empiric emitter of the obelisk gain, and at the heart of an ancient starport embedded in the vessel's twisted spine, the warp portal. Mentally compartmentalizing the Herald of Misery, Czagra divided his boarding forces into 5 large formations, the first split into numerous compact strike teams, whose task was to secure groups of ship fragments at the Ark's surface. Some of these areas would be entry points for the other 4 formations. Each were thrust into the Ark's interior from a separate location, plunging like a red hot all through its structure and denizens alike. Contact was soon lost between the 4 delving strike forces. The Ark Dwarf tainted fabric, foul in communication. Czagra had expected this and was unconcerned, knowing his subcommanders had their orders and understood the price of failure. The 4 groups plunged deeper into the Ark, their vanguard made up of Czagra's mortal followers, cultists, mutants, traitor, guardsmen, and twisted devotees of many kinds, all eminently disposable in the Warpsmith's mind. His sub-commanders employed them to test the integrity of ruptured passages, or with their deaths warn of more insidious dangers such as red floods or severe war taints. For their part, Czaga's conflict of cyber surges hoped to use the mortal soul flares as a means of mapping the Ark's interior by monitoring their spread throughout the Herald of Misery's innards. The mortal followers were also flesh and blood bait with which to lure out lurking threats, and the Iron Warriors soon encountered these in great numbers. Feral tribes of beastmen, slavering Xenos packs, Xenos alone, predators such as Urg, and other less identifiable creatures along the port side of the Herald of Misery. Czagra's forces encountered a rust-cold fungal grove, semi-sentient and fiercely predatory, that spread through dozens of wreck fragments. Most disturbing were tremors that seemed to convulse through the Ark. Cavernous rents the breath of escort ships honeycombed some areas, their ragged sides slick with bubbling organic matter. None who followed them ever returned. Worse was the sudden increase in grinding vibrations, deck plates buckling as something too large to comprehend squirmed its way mindlessly through the Ark. Passages and entire decks were crushed or rent apart as a thing passed. Through gaping fissures it sent up questing pseudopods of mutant warp-tainted flesh to seize mortals and legionaries alike, dragging them out of sight. Grim Zag's war looters. Greatest of the Ark's threats was a sizable infestation of Death Skull orcs under the leadership of war boss Grimzag. Despite their anarchic savagery and scattered presence, they came to pose the most cohesive danger to Czagra's domination of the Arks of Omen. The Iron Warriors encountered them in large numbers in almost every section they fought through. The orcs had been the dominant life form within the Space Hulk before its capture by Vashtor, and they still viewed the vessel as theirs. The Greenkins had spent many happy years fighting the orcs' other denizens, looting and cobbling together all manner of mechanical treasures they discovered into strange weapons and clanging oddities. They gleefully threw themselves into the Iron Warriors at every opportunity, keen to fight the powerful legionaries, and just as eager to relieve them of weapons, armor, and twisted cybernetics. The advances made by Czaga's 4 forces fragmented one by one. Thousands of mortals and dozens of legionaries were lost before they began to fight their way back towards their entry points for extraction by gunships, boarding engines, and armored umbilicals. Though furious with the failure, Czagra was utterly unmoved by his warriors' losses. Regrouping the survivors into a single corps, Czagra led the enlarged strike force in a brutally direct campaign from the Orc's stern towards a mass of fused rock at its prow. They bludgeoned their way from one wreck fragment to the next, massacring feral denizens and blunting orc reprisals with every assault, with breaching charges, meltfire, hammers, and chain fists. The Warsmith's warriors destroyed vast sections and carved open gaping wounds into the Ark structure. Czaga's cybergic conclave unleashed eldritch binaric entities into sections he subjugated, going the enslaved gists to prey on recalcitrant systems and seed the spread of self-replicating cybernetic growths to engulf others. His sigil was seared into bulkheads as a visible mark of his authority. It was meaningless to any remaining denizens, but the Warsmith understood the power of symbols on anything touched by the warp. By carving his mark into its flesh, he hoped to impress upon the Herald of Misery that its master had staked his claim. Czagra and his masked warband plowed inexorably forward. The orcs fought back with a number of brutal and cunning counterattacks, but at best they only managed to temporarily slow the Iron Warriors. Eventually, the majority of the orcs were corralled into a huge maze of caned decks and fractured ship fragments near the huge blunt prow. Czagra, impatient to draw a line under the conflict, ordered the greenkins sealed into that section to be dealt with more fully en route. Departure. After weeks of grueling purges, Czagra declared himself master of the Herald of Misery. Infestations of Xanos and all manner of hidden horrors still lurked throughout the Ark, and the orcs made repeated breakouts from where they had been driven. However, overall control had been established, and Czagra was impatient to depart. Even as a lumbering Ark swung around to leave the isolated mustering point, Czagra dispatched his own hordes of servitor throws and cyber slaves to construct additions of his own design. They began the raising of city-sized bastions bristling with macro cannons. They gouged vast trench systems into the agglomerated vessel surfaces, labyrinthine in design, large enough to admit the biggest god engines and boosting hidden weapon systems for miles around them. The self-appointed mouthpiece of the Warsmith Cyber thus, the Sorcerer, revealed that their attempts at soul mapping the Ark's interior had failed. Empiric schemata they had prepared of large sections turned out to be woefully inaccurate. It was as if internal dimensions had altered and warped as the Iron Warriors had bought through them, chamber-shifting location passages, splitting or connecting to new locations. It was impossible, he admitted to Czagra, to determine if this was due to physical subsistence within the crushed wrecks, or something hideously organic or supernatural. Czagra was privately satisfied that the Ark's seeming resistance would prove a boon should any enemy ever dare board it. Czagra gave his commands to the demonic ferryman, tasked with steering the Ark, and the obelisk gain was ignited, its strobing psychic beacon drawing his fleet in the vessel's wake. With a final order, preparations were made for warp translation. The Warsmith would see his part of the bargain, with Abaddon fully satisfied as swiftly as possible. He wanted no lingering debt to the War Master. The journey would be long. There would be prayer plenty on the long route, and more importantly, time to cement his plans on how to use the Herald of Misery to wreak untold destruction once Abaddon's prize was secured. Reliance quest. While defending a cluster of Imperial worlds, Commander Dante led a boarding party into a seemingly abandoned Ark of Omen within the corpse-strewn expanse of the Space Hulk, known as Night Terror. The Blood Angels discovered mysteries beyond anything they had expected. Few loyalists had boarded an Ark of Omen. Of those, almost all who survived the experience had been too busy fighting for their lives to learn much. Commander Dante's force was thus offered a unique opportunity when they found Night Terror reduced to a drifting Charlus, and even its most monstrous den is banished or driven into the depths. Even as Dante puzzled over the slaughtered heretics and the otherworldly foliage sprouting amongst them, his librarians found the Ark's captive warp portal. This shimmering disk of empiric energies was caged by an elaborate mechanism at the heart of a vaulted chamber. Orgone Technic control shrines surrounded it. Cadaverous statues flanked the ruin, inscribed ramp leading up to the portal's moor from the distribution of slain, cultist and blood-sprayed patterns. The Blood Angels could tell many heretics had died defending the portal, but the device had not been employed to summon reinforcements to the fight. After performing what divinations they could, the librarians declared that this portal was intended to receive some artifact and transport it elsewhere. Such a conclusion tallied with the scant reports of strange prizes seized by Bale fleets and spirited away to their Arks of Omen. Yet this only raised more unsettling questions. What linked these peculiar arcana? Surely even the servants of chaos were not insane enough to seal lumps of bedrock broken machines and time-worn statues without greater purpose. The captive portals must be intended to transport the strange prizes. But to where did they all go? To the same place. Most maddening and ominous of all. To what end? Perhaps it was some spark of his Primarch's prescience stirring in his blood, or his great experience speaking. So, whatever the case, Commander Dante knew that the answers to these questions were vital. Thus, even as he took up the quest to discover more about the mysterious force that had depopulated Night Terror, the chapter master assigned several strike forces to a different mission, each led by a librarian and borne aboard swift sword-class freegods. These warrior bands were charged with discovering the secrets of the warp portals aboard the Arks of Omen, and through them, the dark secrets behind the artifacts seized by the Bale fleets. Strike Force Rally. Epistolary Venato Rallion was the most senior Blood Angels librarian to board Night Terror, and he had examined its portal chamber in detail. He was a natural choice to lead one of Dante's questing forces. Relion was a warrior mystic with over a century of combat experience. A well-respected commander who had forged honor bonds both within the Blood Angels chapter and beyond. He wasted no time in assembling his strike force from amongst those battle brothers who had won his respect during his long decades of war. Relion himself was amongst the more gifted of the Blood Angel Psychers. What truly elevated him was the precision and control with which he wielded his powers. The librarian's aspect was as carefully crafted as graven stone. His craggy features radiated reassurance, his demeanor measured wisdom. He rarely raised his voice, Yet his stern words were heard by all and given great weight. So it was too when Ryan unleashed the powers of the warp, eschewing Paroshnik flare. The epistolary instead focused the tightly tremble fury of his red thirst into pinpoint manifestations. He could puncture foes' hearts, sever their spines, or overload their delicate mechanical systems from half a battlefield away with the accuracy and power of a sniper shot, further augmenting both his authority and might. Malian wielded the masterwork for sword, Carminius. Before this relic weapon's fury, no shield could hold, while the sight of it caused the hearts of all blood angels to swell with pride and determination. Several other heroes of the chapter aided Raelion in his quest. There was a Cenari priest, Matteo Donas, an unusually dire character amongst his chapter, yet one whose deep conviction and eye for danger had long ago impressed Relian. The two warriors fought alongside one another whenever the fates allowed. There was Virante Calmo, a Tecarin possessed of a relentless determination that bordered upon the obsessive, and whose lack of charisma was more than made up for by his merciless strength of will. Then there was the dynamic Lieutenant Tasson Leodas, who was in many ways the polar opposite of both Donas and Charmot. Aggressive, guileless, and possessed of a swift wit, the left. Tennant personified the most charismatic facets of his chapter's Jean Sire, and was a firm favorite for those who followed him to war. The warriors Raelion led to battle were drawn from amongst the Blood Angel 2nd and 3rd companies. There were the intercessors of Squad Agalo, who formed the backbone of the force, and the assault intercessors of Squad Gabrias, youthful hotheads, handpicked by Lieutenant Leodas himself. The Blade Guard of Squad Aurelion, meanwhile, were sworn to the stoic defense of Brother Donas, and they had vowed to shield the Sangari priest wherever he undertook his sacred duty. Aggressor Squad Dantos and Eradicator Squad Ensos provided the strike forces heavy firepower. The former went about their duties with a ferocity that raised eyebrows amongst their commanders, whilst the latter were infamous for their gallow sense of humor and the ruthless artistry with which they plied their weapons. The strike force was completed by Scout Squad Gatello, whose grizzled sergeant had a reputation for turning out bands of accomplished but bloodthirsty swordsmen. This, then, was the questing band who took ship aboard the swift frigate Star of Dawn and set off to discover the secrets of the Arks of Omen. They faced a dark and dangerous mission, and as yet had little idea how they might complete it. Yet they were a potent force of expert warriors. If anyone could fulfill the duty appointed to them, it was the Battle Brothers, a strike force Raelion, the road to enlightenment. After taking counsel with his officers to garner suggestions for how the quest should proceed, Raleigh first had the Star of Dawn make warp for the Gigo system. Rumor had it a Bale fleet had been sighted bearing down on the shrine world of Pathos. Rian was not yet certain how to complete his mission. The Arks of Omen were vast and deadly, even without taking into account the attendant Bale fleets, and one frigate stood no chance against such a foe. Yet he was not sure by what means study from afar or covert infiltration could be effected, or whether they would prove sufficient. However, in Rallin's experience, opportunities presented themselves to the proactive. He hoped that by trailing their quarry and watching for an opening, the Blood Angels would see a way forward in their quest. He was also conscious that in an era as dark as this, the might of the Blood Angels were sorely needed all across the Imperium. They could not afford to waste more time than they must, even in a duty as vital as this. By the time Star of Dawn translated into the Gigo system, the Ark and its fleet had wrought havoc and moved on. The Blood Angels bore witness to the horrors left in the heretics' wake. Slain void ships guttered amidst the darkness. Fox channels rang with laments for the countless dead, while shrine cities and defense platforms burned. Relion brought his force into orbit above ravaged Pathos, but it soon became clear that there was little to be learned here. The foe had bombarded the planet's offensive bastions before launching a planet-wide invasion, during which countless rags and precious tomes had been stolen. Any, or perhaps none, might have been the prizes sought by this Ark of Omen. It was impossible to tell. The Blood Angels deployed to Pathos' surface. Nonetheless, the Helotic forces yet remained left behind by their Bale fleet. Any hope that a knowledgeable victim could be snatched for interrogation soon evaporated. However, the traitors that remained on the Shrine world were drags, fanatical cultists and renegades who had descended into barbarism, madness, or mindless mutation. Knowing they could not put aside their duty to aid the planet's scattered defenders, Strike Force rallying departed Pathos and the Geo system with heavy hearts. Trials and disappointments followed. The Bale fleets were not attacking en masse, but were rather scattered across vast galactic gulfs, even as travel and communication were catastrophically hamstrung by the turbulence of the warp. And it took Strike Force Rally many weeks to detect each lead they were able to find, and longer still to chase down what often proved to be phantasmal or long-departed quarry. Reports of a Bale fleet attacking the Valmore belt turned out to be mistaken, and brought the Strike Force into an ill-matched conflict with kin of the Kronos Hegemony. The Blood Angels retreated rather than risk needless annihilation. The next report of the Beast in Scarlet Bale fleet assailing the Thinite worlds proved accurate. The Blood Angels found their quarry locked in a ferocious void battle with the Necron fleet, the Star of Dawn close to scanning range. Rally hoped to study the Beast in Scarlet while the Ark's masters were distracted and embattled. However, by the time the frigate was forced to disengage by Necron tomb ships, it had become clear that external energy spectra could tell the Blood Angels little. They would likely have to get aboard an Ark if they wished to learn more. Rallian was not willing to risk lives in a boarding action without a far clearer plan of what they should do once aboard their target Ark. It was not enough to fight their way to the warp portal and hope for insights once they reached it. The time had come to call upon the aid of an old honor brother, whom Ralliant had not seen in almost half a century. Battered but unbowed, the Star of Dawn turned its prow towards distant Estrom, home world of the Tomekeeper chapter, Kisia Bakir, taciturn and somber. Brother Bakir is a solitary soul within the Tomekeeper chapter, and something of an enigma to his battle brothers. Nowhere born into the ranks of House Maru, it is rumored that he entered the trial of pages, the Tomekeeper selection process for new aspirants voluntarily rather than take up his duties as head of his family. Bakir has never talked about his past, nor have his fellow librarians ever gleaned anything from him, for he is a master of obfuscation, misdirection, and illusion. While these psychic talents have proven useful in many theaters of war, particularly in service to vanguard strike forces, Bakia's greatest strength lies in his study of war portals and the manipulation of imperial tides. He has devoted much of his time over his 2 centuries of service to seeking an understanding of these phenomena. And it was his dire warnings that saw the Tomekeeper's first company redeployed to the Cadian Gate just before Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade poured from it. The Rite of Echoes, Epistoion, at last enjoyed good fortune in achieving a swift and safe warp transit to Istroma. Moreover, upon arriving at the solemn world, he found the battle brother he sought cloistered away amidst the Tomekeeper's endless libraries. Raleigh experienced a quietly joyous reunion with Codicia Bakia before the 2 librarians turned to more serious matters. To Raleigh's surprise, he found the insightful Bakia was already studying the very problem with which he wrestled, albeit from a different starting point. The Tomekeepers had their own closely guarded means of garnering information from across the war-torn galaxy, and it had long been habits between Valion and Bakia that they not pry into their respective chapters' secrets. Valion accepted at face value the Codicia's revelation that he had been able to piece together fragments of multiple after-action reports and distress calls from war zones where the Arks of Omen had attacked. Bakier had noted references, however tangential or brief, to the war portals that every Ark of Omen seemed to possess. There were more data points the Codicia had compiled and correlated that steadily firmed up his conclusions. But time was pressing, and Ralon was willing to take his honor brother's assertions on trust. It was enough to note that Becky, like the Blood Angels, had concluded that understanding the portals and their purpose could be key to defeating the Arks of Omen. What Valian had hoped, Abakia now confirmed, was that the learned Cody had plumbed his chapter's most restricted books of law and discovered a potential solution to their problem. It was a psychic ritual Bakia called the Rite of Echoes. Combining his extensive studies of empiric portals and real space entanglements with insights from scholars dating back to pre-imperial times. He describes the rite to Raleigh as dropping a stone down a well and listening to its echoes in order to determine the depth of the well and the destination point of the stone. Of course, this undertaking was infinitely more complex and perilous. Their well, Bakier observed, was likely an entire labyrinth of tunnels, all emptying out into other wells and infested with malevolent entities who did not take kindly to the dropping of stones. When Valian expressed concern at the risks involved, Bakier laughed bleakly. He had not yet been able to attempt his ritual, he explained, but his chapter master had refused point-blank the Cody's request for a strike force to help him. This was because the rite could only be conducted in the presence of an active and fully awakened warp portal, and such a thing could only be found aboard or attached to a battle-ready and operational Ark of Omen. It was in short a virtual suicide mission, which under strength and far scattered Tomekeepers could not afford. Now, though, with the aid of Strikeforce Relian, Bakir believed there might be a chance, albeit not for head-on assault. However, Rallian's warriors, supplemented with whatever battle brothers Bakia could call upon, represented a formidable enough force that they might board a damaged or embattled Ark while its defenders' attention was turned to wider conflict. Then moving swiftly and accepting that steep casualties were likely, they could push to the site of the warp portal, conduct their ritual, and pull out before the scattered defenders of the colossal Ark could fully mobilize, returning by whatever means to the Star of Dawn, provided the frigate had been able to evade the guns of the foe. The survivors of the strike force would escape with the vital knowledge they had gained. It was a desperate plan, and the librarians debated its necessity and nuances for long hours. In the end, they agreed that the Emperor's angels had been built for such odds as these, and that the ends justified the risks. Moreover, Bakia confided that he knew where they might begin their hunt, provided they moved quickly. Word had reached the tomb keepers of an attack upon a deep void astropathic relay station in the same subsector as Estuma. The assault had been conducted by a Baal fleet, and at its head sailed the vast malevolent Ark known as the Herald of Misery. Opportunistic obliteration, Warpsmith. Czagra stood immobile as the rings of the umbilical boarding conduit pulsated around him. Magnetic talons in the boots of his Terminator armor gripped the umbilical's biomechanical inner surface. The Herald of Misery's gravity tugged at the Warpsmith as the varying conduit snaked towards the doom station before it. At Czagra's shoulder stood Karbal Mandra, his master of executions, and Verno the Grey. Dozens of Verno's elite bronze-wrought veterans stood in ordered ranks behind them in front of the Warpsmith, clinging to barbed excursions that lined the conduit. Bobs of cultists strove to maintain their positions. Throngs of the Rivenary forged cult had been given the honor of forging the Warpsmith's path of conquest into the deep space station. Czagra heard them wee, in the thin air burdened he knew under the weight of detritus, sparking machine parts and corroded bionics. He did not deign to lay his eyes upon them. They were fodder to absorb the firepower of the station's defenders. Nothing more. What is the plan? And Warpsmith asked Verno. Flickering lumen encrusted the board onto its curved surface, some with the staring lamp-like eyes of scuttling demonic automatter, but they reflected only dully from Verno's scorched and aerated armor. Mechanteer's conclave have ordered the station's wardens hoard a cache of soul-bright witches. They will be of great use as sacrifices to secure the Dark God's power. Better that than feeding the MAGA Lord of Terror. We breach their bulkheads. We crush their fire points. We find where they keep their witches. Once they are mine, the station will fear my wrath in full. They will be naught but dust for any that come looking for it. Mandra stirred at Verno's side, and temporary lucidity resurfacing from the depths of his mind. Abaddon's prize, he grunted, will not be forgotten. Czagra replied sternly, we do not veer from the Despoiler's goal. Yet, while the Ark slave psychers snip out our next point of translation to reach it, I will not ignore this bastion of imperial arrogance, not when it dares to exist. With violent tremors that threaten to dislodge the cultist, the umbilical clamped onto the outer hull of the astropathic relay station. Its armor was strong, fortified with the greatest technologies the Adeptus Astro Telepopathica could demand. Yet still, its metallic skin was pierced by the Moore engines that ringed the Herald of Misery's boarding tendrils. A shriek of tortured metal, and the howl of equalizing pressure echoed through the umbilical before an aperture in front of the cultist virus opened. Showers of sparks lit up the invaders. Czagra gave a dismissive gesture, and the cultists swarmed into the station with shouted curses. Czagra strode through the breach, his warriors forming up around him. Warning klaxons blared, smoke belched from out-of-control fires. Detonations and the creak of the installation's compromised structures sounded from distant sections. Over it all was laid the sounds of battle made deafeningly loud in the confined corridors. Solid slugs whirred like startled game from the smoke-filled passage as Czagra barged down it. Ricochets sparked from bulkheads and his armor. His predator's gaze caught glimpses of Imperial defenders amidst the smoke. They wore black tunics under crimson armor and ornately crested helmets that carried the sigil of an eye. The high-howered lace guns that they bore connected to bulky targeters that covered their visors like mechanical veils. Czagra reached the first of his mortal cannon fodder. Dead and dying cultist crunched under his tread. Supplicatory shrieks cut off as his boots popped rib cages. The main passageway widened, dawning light. While the situation worsened on Lumet 4, the Star of Dawn slipped from the warp on the system's egg. Blood Angel's Liberian Valiant had the frigate lurk within a dark nebula. While readings were taken and strategic auras performed, the doom of the Loom system swiftly became apparent. So too did an opportunity. Though the distances involved made certainty impossible, it appeared much of the Herald of Misery Bale fleet was scattered through the system in ongoing engagements. This left the Ark of Omen comparatively open to swift boarding assault. Such an attempt was laden with risks which were enumerated by Sangari priest Donas and Tech Marine Chalmo during the heated conference that now took place in the Star of Dawn stratagem. It would take time for the frigate to cross the Gulf of Space to reach Lumet 4, during which heretic warships might detect and attack it. Even alone, the Ark possessed colossal firepower and could make short work of the approaching Frigo if by the blessings of their emperor. The Space Marines made it aboard. They might be overrun or their ship destroyed before they could complete their mission. All this was true, Ryan allowed. Yet, they were unlikely to get a better opportunity, an approach through the system's drifting dust nebula, and then between the screening debris of the ongoing orbital conflict would allow them to close on their target. A lunge by their nimble frigate or to permit them to deploy by boarding torpedoes. After this, it would be up to the Star of Dawn's crew to keep their vessel alive while Strike Force Rally could achieve their mission and contrive for a means to escape from the Herald of Misery ready for pickup. His plan was one only. The Adeptus could possibly execute against such odds. Yet more than ever, the Liberian felt a dreaded presentiment of time running short. He sensed they must strike now, no matter the risks. Swayed by Rallian's conviction, his battle brothers acceded. Mere minutes after the Space Marines left the Strategium to make ready, the Star of Dawn lit its real space thrusters. and began its approach towards loom of 4-foot hole. Of hook 3. Epistolary rally greeted his teeth and heard his restrained harness creak under the boarding pot's punishing acceleration. Strapped in around him, in the crimson-lit gloom were Tech Marine Charalmo and his servitors, the intercessors of Squad Agalno and Sergeant Dantos' aggressors. Theirs was one of 6 torpedoes launched from the bespoke retrofitted launch tubes of the Star of Dawn. 3 of the projectiles transported the remainder of Valiant Strike Force and their Tomekeeper's allies, while the other 2 were dummy munitions fired as ablative escorts. All streaked away from the sword-class frigate towards the mountainous flank of the Herald of Misery. Upon nearing Lumet 4, the Star of Dawn had found the Herald of Misery still unaccompanied. The frigate's crew had approached the Ark of Omen under the cover of a wreckage belt that tumbled in the wake of a dying orbital defense platform. It had been a feat of arrogation to weave between the huge chunks of drifting wreckage and sparkling debris without being struck. But the nimble Star of Dawn had proven equal to the task. Like an ambush hunter, the warship had waited as the Herald of Misery's course brought it steadily closer, then pounced. Now Leon could hear the Star of Dawn's shipmaster and his crew exchanging clipped words over the Vogt as they and the Space Marines endured the most perilous moments of the attack run. Raleigh and his battle brothers faced a gauntlet of point-blank fire before the thunderous impact with the Ark of Omen's hull. For the Star of Dawn, there was a swift dive through the Herald of Misery's fire zones, then a hard burn to escape the huge vessel's clutches, even while enduring G-forces that would have killed an unaugmented human. The librarian monitored his Vox and vid feeds with fierce intensity. This so-called Ark is an abomination, Vox Sergeant. Agolo. That it is, brother, Rion replied. A truly monstrous thing. He watched the colossal warship grow to fill the torpedo's forward beat feeds. It felt like racing towards a fortified mountain range. The Ark's hide was a patchwork of human and Xenos engineering, mingled randomly with disturbing biomechanical extrusions. He saw a forest of archaic towers protruding from a region of overlapping metal and stone, ghostly aurora dancing between their tips. He noted what appeared to be a localized storm system ranging around an alien-made dome, in defiance of the void and reason both. Cradles of scaffold rose in many places. New defensive structures just stating within them that bore all the hallmarks of Iron Warrior's construction. Uncountable lights studied the macro vessel's hull. Some doubtless indicated occupied regions of the vessel, Valiant thought, or external systems at work. Many others were clearly weapons in placement, even now spitting streams of fire that could spell doom for the strike force before its mission even began, as though their machine spirits shared his misgivings. The boarding torpedoes' pile-on speed commenced evasive maneuvers and jettisoned clouds of electroshaft. Projectiles whipped soundlessly past them in the airless void, but none found their mark. The Iron Warriors may believe they excel in raising their heretical fortifications, but they are far from adept at defending them. Voxed Lieutenant Leardas, his arch observation, raised chuckles from a number of the Space Marines. These were silenced in the next instant as a Cyclopean energy cannon on the Ark's hull spat a furious crimson blast. The mere radiation burst released by its firing caused the vid feeds to white out and drowned the Vox in static. Throne of Terror cursed Sergeant Dantos. Their torpedo shuddered violently. Its lumen flickered. Only half the vid feeds returned to functionality. Voices rose gradually from the hissing static morass of the boxet. The bridge crew of the Star of Dawn sounding like ghost in Rallian's ear. Again. This is Star of Dawn. Ertic energy cannon fire evaded. No damage to of Dawn. One dummy torpedo lost. No damage. Occupy projectiles. Bring her about, Mr. Foul, and put us beyond that monsters. Alert. Energy cannon fire into the debris field. I don't know what hit, Lord, but energy readings are spiking off the scale. No throne. Destabilizing plasma reactor. Get us clear of the blast zone now. Beatings critical. Emergency prayers. Rally scowl as on the rearward vid feed. A newborn star bloomed amidst the debris belt. He saw the plasmic shockwave roll outwards, vaporizing everything in its path. Though the ship was now small and distant, he saw the moment its battered void shields flared out under the ferocious bombardment. The plasma star dissipated, but not swiftly enough for the Star of Dawn, which listed off course obviously crippled. "Sanguinius preserve them!" cried sanguinary priest Donas. His exultation went unanswered. The ferocious crimson beam reached out from the Herald of Misery for a second time, and though the torpedo's external feeds were banished by its energy wash, there could be no doubt as to the warship's fate. Impact in 5 seconds, called Chalmo. Rallian just had time to brace himself before their torpedo fired retro rockets, then struck the hull of the Ark like a thunderbolt. The shock of impact was redoubled for the epistolary as the death agonies of the Star of Dawn crew battered him. Grav baffles engaged and harnesses flexed, helping the Space Marines weather the colossal deceleration. Flashing rune panels indicated the torpedo's melted torches had engaged. An adept readout showed its progress as it burrowed like a parasite into the Ark of Omen's hide. The torpedo shuddered violently. The screech of metal sounded dimly through its hull. Rising Action 3. Voxit Quiescence. Contact with other torpedoes lost. Probable cause. Hull density coupled with vocalized anomalous radiation, reported Charmo in his signature monotone. I am maintaining scans on all frequencies. Will reacquire at earliest opportunity. Prepare yourselves, brothers, said Valian. This is now also a mission of vengeance for those aboard the Star of Dawn. The torpedo jolted violently. There came a vingenous lurch of falling. Then another even harder impact. Stillness followed. Through the hull came a muffled cacophony of gunfire and shouts that Valian knew all too well. "Release!" ordered the librarian, punching his harnesses, unlocking rune and rising. A somber chime rolled through the torpedo's transport compartment, followed by the hard banks of locking bolts disengaging. The power of the torpedo blasted clear to emit harsh light, whirling smoke, and the den of bolter and auto gunfire. "Advance and engage," Rion ordered as he led his battle brothers out of the boarding torpedo. "For the Emperor and Sanguinius," roared Sergeant Dantos as he and his aggressors flanked right. "Death to the heretics," barked Sergeant Argallo, leading his intercessors out on Relion's left flank. The librarian himself stepped up the center, with Carminius drawn. The chamber was cavernous, its walls concealing a scabrous tangle of cabling and rusted metal that had been methodically reinforced with riveted girders painted with hazard stripes. Relian noted the crisscrossing network of conveyor belts, cranes, and strange flesh metal machines crowding the space and the mountains of cargo, containers, and munition stacked between them. More pressing, however, was a battle raging before him. Rion's torpedo had punched through close to Lieutenant Leodus, who had already led the warriors of Assault Intercessor, Squad Gabrias, and Eradicator Squad Enzos into battle. They fought chaos, cultists who had masked to meet the Blood Angels' incursion. These were ragged figures, most of whom wore crude iron masks, and whose bodies were deformed by clumsy bionics. Many cultists already lay dead, hacked and blasted by the advancing Blood Angels. More were pouring in between the machinery and container stacks to join the fight. To the left, Tenant Rion ordered. He sent a bolt of psychic energy lashing out to boil the blood of a half-dozen cultists. The heretics gave bubbling screams and dropped steaming to the deck. Squad Gallows bolt rifles boomed, blowing apart cultists with every shot, even as jets of fire belched from Squad Dantos' flamestorm gauntlets to engulf more of the luckless heretics. Like a wounded beast, the mass of cultists recoiled from this fresh assault, and as Leodus and his brothers continued to carve through their ranks began to waver. Reacquisition ritual successful, reported Brother Sharmo, Gudisia Bakia and his brothers, establishing secondary bridgehead 370 yards, localized south of our position. Same deck level. Sangari Priest. Donis's torpedo experienced minor course deviation. It impacted 842 yards to localize north of our position. An estimate one deck structure above ours. I am reinitializing box choristry and plotting optimal rendezvous coordinates. X loading to strike force, tactical manifold. As the Tekmari made his report, Rallian and his brother struck the enemy lines. With vengeful fury, the librarian hacked and hewed with Carminius, leaving bodies dismembered in his wake. Dantos' aggressors blundered their foes into pulp and reduced more than a score to fire blackened corpses in less than a minute. Unable to withstand the Blood Angels' onslaught, and with no sign of their Iron Warrior masters to bolster their courage, the cultists broke and ran. Some attempted a fighting retreat, but a few well-placed ball shells shattered their resistance and turned flight to rout. As suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The Blood Angels held their positions, reloading their weapons and mustering benedictions to their machine spirits. Relin was pleased to see his warriors had suffered no more than a few minor wounds while securing their bridgehead. He hoped the rest of their force had fared as well. With a twitch of his psychic abilities, Rally reached out to Codicea back. How do you fare? We have driven off initial resistance, but Sergeant Titana assures me further foes are massing. The Tombkeeper's Liberian replied, "We are coming to you. I am sorry for the loss of your ship. There will be time later to honor that sacrifice," thought Saint Rallion. For now, we must determine a new extraction plan. I will seek possibilities, brother. In the meantime, what is your will? This is your command after all. We are a group and press forward," replied Rallian. "You and I will bend our powers to locate the war portal, and then we seize the information we came for." "As simple as that?" asked Arise Saber to his sending. "Emperor willing, brother," said Valium before withdrawing from his brother Liberian's mind, as he contemplated the vast and hostile labyrinth of the Herald of Misery spreading out before them, and the odds ranged against his small force. He found himself doubting that any part of this mission would be simple at all. Conflict 3. Part 4. A Desperate Gambit. Verno the Grey strode through the Herald of Misery. He carried the demon blade, a Kur, its bloodthirsty whispers haunting his mind. At his back marched a band of bronze-wrought Terminators, all marked as he was, the sigil of Warpsmith Czagra, Grand Marshal of Ruin. This was but one of 13 hunting parties, mostly under Verno's command, closing like a barbed net around the invaders who profaned the Warpsmith's Arks of Omen. Between them, Verno knew his warriors possessed the strength to lay waste to armies, cities, and perhaps worlds. "Oh, so why?" he muttered. "Am I disqued?" If Verno were wholly honest with himself, he knew the answer to this question. Much like his master, he despised unknowns, and too much remained uncertain about this foe. He checked his helm's chrono. The invaders had been aboard the Herald of Misery for almost 16 hours. In that time, the Loyalists had passed through territories ruled by several of Czagra's minor champions. They had reaped a tally of helms, splitters, cut worms while escaping the clattering halls, descended the hollow ways into the dark bleaker, and emerged unbowed. Dared the monsters hunting through the wreck of the Magdalena survived the hellish bio-furnaces ruled by the core, the emulator, and seen off the attack of the Zappa Drakes. Warband reports suggested the invaders had bled for their efforts, but Verno could not fault their cunning speed and tenacity. When the Loyalists had first boarded his ark, Czagra told Verno he believed them the advanced guard of some larger assault, or perhaps a diversionary force sent to leave him off balance when the two-strike came. Privately, Verno had remained skeptical, for a force of more than 50 Loyalist Space Marines was a potent army in its own right. He knew, though the Czagra was consumed with masterminding their campaign on the planet below, and that the Warsmith expected his underlings and the malevolent perils of the Ark itself to be capable of putting page to the invaders without his having to involve himself. Thus Verno had kept his counsel to himself as the boarders cut their way through a number of lesser warp bands and pushed deeper into the Ark. It was when the invaders' course stopped meandering and became as straight as a lance beam pushed upwards into the Ark's spinal labyrinth. The Czagra's attitude changed. It seemed unlikely now that any reinforcements were coming to aid the boarding party, for surely they would have struck by this point. Nor did it seem probable anymore that they were a mere distraction. The change of direction implied the boarders had a target and had now determined its whereabouts. Had they come as saboteurs, as assassins? Had they learned of the task Abaddon had set Czagra and sought to foil it? Did they bear some apocalyptic weapon with which they hoped to slay the Herald of Misery? Perhaps a vortex warhead or vials of life-eater virus? Whatever the truth, Czagra was no longer content to leave the loyalists to be worn down or captured. Coldly enraged at this ongoing distraction, the Warpsmith ordered them crushed without further delay, and entrusted Verno with the task. They entered the screaming decks, reported Carball Mandra over Verno's helm. The Axemen commanded a party of iron warriors and cultists, and had been charged with pressuring the lawyers' flanks and forcing them into Verdo's planned killbox. They passed through the 19th rune gate, reported Barakor, a champion commanding another of Verno's hunting parties. Make them climb, Verno responded. Do not permit them to flee to the beast pit or break out towards the neon clusters. As you command, Lord, said Barakor, the boom of Baltfire underpinning his words. We hold firm. We have iron within. We are driving them up the third stair. Ruins blinked on Vernoc's helm orbs, showing him the approximate positions of his forces and those of the foe on a flickering tri-dimensional map. He doubted its accuracy for the Herald of Misery and contorted when left unobserved, and the storm of radiation flowing from the vast vessel. Foul all but the most hardened systems. Still, the map served for general positioning. Looking at it now, Verno could see that if they did not hurry, he and his warriors might arrive too late to join the slaughter. He quickened his pace, climbing a rusting stairway and passing through a yawning bulkhead that had sprouted bangs and eyes. Secure, are your Warpsmiths ready? He voxed. The voice that answered was a flat snarl laced with scrap code static. Confirm. The cavern stands conjoined. We are one with the engine gist that can trigger the barrier emitters at will, then enact phase primers, commanded Verno. On his map, Verno saw crimson lines spreading up across doorways and corridors. The runes beside them denoted barrier force fields. Perhaps once atmospheric lockdown systems, or whatever mangled vessels made up the screaming decks triggered by the Warpsmiths, interfacing with local control consoles. These fields now formed impenetrable barriers that would herd the loyalists into Verno's trap. The designator runes indicated the intruders halted, as though the foe knew they were being herded and were casting about for any alternative path. Accelerating to a jog, Verno led his warriors up a spiraling metal ramp whose low ceiling was festooned with leaking cables and sparking wires. Haste! We close on them! He barked at his warriors, whose Terminator plate made them slower and more lumbering than himself. After another few turns on the ramp and a brass blast door, the den of gunfire and war cries finally washed over Verno. Beyond the door lay a steeply caned chamber that must once have been part of some Xenos craft. Fluids had run from its blister-like consoles, hardening into resonance stalactites in which fossilized circuitry glinted. Organo-technological protrusions sprouted from the walls and floors, their purposes unclear. At the chamber's far end, its structure flowed like tallow into a human-built stairway of cavernous dimensions. Fashioned with brushed metal and decorated with vox gargoyles that vomited static lace. Come back 3. Vino staggered. The sound grew muffled around him. His twin heartbeat thudded in his ears and his vision blurred until colors flowed around him like spilled ink. He tried to fire off a volley or swing a gore at the librarian, but his body would not obey. Verno was suddenly faced by the possibility that he was about to be slain by warpcraft. He found himself desperate and furious of the thought. horrified by his sudden powerlessness. Then, as suddenly as they manifested, the strange phenomena abated as Varrock's sight swam into focus. He saw that his surroundings had altered far more so than seemed possible in the few moments he had been incapacitated. Realization dawned swiftly that it had not only been a few moments. Whatever the librarian had done to his mind, a glance at his helm. Chrono told Varrock his fugue state had lasted until almost 3 minutes, an eon by the standards of so furious a battle. There was no sign either of the enemy nor of the force field barrier that should have kept them trapped. Distantly, Vano could still hear the sounds of fighting, and a glance showed him all but his personal bodyguard of Terminators who pushed on in pursuit of the Loyalists. Yet the enemy had slipped the trap, and Vernon knew of a half-dozen routes they could take from here. His flickering rune map suggested the foe had split up and taken at least 2 of them. The better to avoid being trapped again, he cursed and glared around at the warriors awaiting his orders. There will be consequences, he said. He, for one, would not wish to be Sector or his tech covens when Czagra discovered that they had failed to prevent the tech marine from sabotaging the force field wall. Unless you wish to feel them personally, make haste. Looking at the runes on his Auspex map, Verocco felt a growing suspicion about the Loyalist target. For once, uncertainty might have been preferable. Contact the Warpsmith, he ordered, as he stared out in pursuit of his quarry. Warn him the intruders may be making for the warp portal. They are psychers, with them more powerful than we had gleaned. Czagra frowned upon dark worship amidst his followers, but Verloc was almost tempted to offer a prayer to the dark gods. He could not conceive of the invaders destabilizing the energies of the warp portal, but if somehow they could, might such an attack see the entire Ark destroyed? He trod on a fallen Loyalist scout, his Syriamite shard boot crushing the warrior's chest and ending his last hitching breaths. These invaders will bleed for their insolence, thought Verno. Whatever it was they sought to achieve here, he would see that they failed. Rising Action 3. Ba. The invasion of Lume 4. Many of Lume 4's anti-orbital defenses had been obliterated during the initial bombardment by the Herald of Misery, allowing the heretics to make planet fall. Yet, greater destruction had been planned in meticulous detail by the Arks of Omen's master, and he poured ever-increasing numbers of his iron warriors into the invasion. With the Shrine World's ability to inflict any appreciable damage on the Herald of Misery wiped out, the Arks of Omen could have continued to rain down destruction on Spool. After Sprawl had Kzagra wished. But the Warsmith was conscious of endangering the very key fragment he had come here to seize. Kzagra's thorough strategy for eliminating every iota of resistance saw more heretics make planetball on every continent. Some of them were drawn from the flotillas that have besieged the planet's 4 defense platforms, free deployed at Kzagra's command, now that the platforms have been overrun. On Lume 4, his fellow champions and warriors overran isolated outposts and reduced them to burning shells. intercepted and gutted trade convoys, making last-second dashes for safety, demolished habitats, defiled shrines, and breached bastions. As huge and deadly as the Herald of Misery was, it remained a single ship. Spread as they were across the face of the planet, only a few of Lumay's densely populated sprawls suffered. In the early days of the invasion, they were centers of faith, whether in the God Emperor or the Omnissiah, industrial powerhouses, pristine megalopses of sacred import, or heavy macrohabs, teeming with humanity. Some sprawls were linked to each other by webs of political and martial power through which they offered mutual defense. However, as the war ground on, many more sprawls became isolated, and the once distant front lines scored jagged scars through their cores. The battles for central Valenta. Kazaga's methodical surface war on Loom 4 had one primary aim: to locate the key fragment promised to Abaddon as a spoiler. At the heart of each of the war masters attacking armies or following on through the ruins and butchery in their wake, groups of slave psychers sniffed out the spore of the esoteric object. It was to enable this search that his continued bombardment had so far targeted Lumay 4's anti-orbital batteries, as Kazaga's slave psychers trawled the areas conquered by his armies on multiple continents. A tantalizing pattern emerged in the region of central Valenta. Heroes overseeing handlers reported the spore was strong. In central Valenta's north, Sprawl Lindengrave had been reduced to ruins before any of Kazaga's warb bands had even set foot in it. The flaming meter of Har system monitor, one of the world's naval defenders, had plummeted into the Sprawl's outskirts. The catastrophic impact had ravaged the Sprawl in a firestorm and buried the remnants under a new landscape of rock, plastrate, and metal. Incredibly, less than half of Lindengay's citizens and soldiers had perished. The sprawl was built atop a flattened hyperdense massif in whose honeycomb of tunnels many of the defenders had already been sheltered when the disaster struck the city. In the days that followed, as Lindenra survivors managed to break through into the layers of debris, ruins, and steaming ejector piled atop the massive. Through this infernal termite mound, they fought the cult of the Scarendrex and Iron Warriors of the Xenarth Forge Seers, battle sisters of the Order of the Sacred Rose and of the Order of the Valorous Heart, led fanatical militia, wounded Imperial Guardsmen, and roaring preachers in daring guerrilla raids and counterattack attacks. For a day, the hidden battle lines moved back and forth, neither side able to bring enough forces to bear to overwhelm the other. This deadlock was broken when the Lord Discordant Dragoth Vactran discovered an entrance to the massive tunnel network, driving packs of demon engines before him like slaving hounds before a huntsman. Vreen plunged deep inside, either trapped in the tunnels or hunted down through the wreckage mound. Lindenrave survivors were slowly and methodically ground to extinction. To the east of Lindengrave lay Sprawcore So, quant a Ford spool under the opaces of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was host to large numbers of Qatari war cohorts from Metallica and Stais, ate alongside battalions of Imperial Guardsmen, Faced with overwhelming heretic armor, the senior tech priest Dominus Reclavus, Prime Krell, sought to funnel the war engines into hidden traps and kill boxes. She marshaled the heavy firepower at her command, determined to maximize her force's kill ratio. Companies of heretic vindicators, land raiders, and super heavy artillery blasted apart Gal's forward elements as the tanks advanced, supported by a cabal of Iron Warrior sorcerers, Chaos Titans of Leo, Yeetrex, and Traitor Knights of House Ferocian ground defense lines under their iron tread, as their huge cannons roared a dirge of destruction. Swifter squadrons of Chaos Predators encircled Corezo Contart's lines, unleashing their heavy weaponry at vulnerable sections like pack hunters slashing the flanks of a lumbering beast. Greg's masterful traps were blown apart, and the combined efforts of her maniples and companies to stall the foe were crushed. In desperation, the Iron Warriors assault companies breached her rear guard. The Ted Priest Dominus activated an ancient Hydrog atomizer. The supposedly forbidden explosive device spread the legendary Sanguinius Scourge, a wave of radiating flux that she was sure would reduce the heretics to radioactive slurry in their armor. Its effects on Crack's own forces were devastating, but she had weighed their loss as acceptable to strike down the attackers. When the Scourge's particle field reached the Iron Warriors, it slammed against an empiric shield thrown up by their sorcerers, who held its worst effects back with Arcan formula fueled by their hatred. Most of the remaining Imperial Guardsmen died in seconds to the Sanguinius Scourge. Drakestari fared better, but with their remaining biological components sewing from their frames, they were unable to halt the final push of the heretic assault tanks, which glowed with the Scourge's remnant radiation as they smashed through the fading resistance, closing on the prize with every new report that came in from his slave psychers throughout central Valenta. Czagra's calculating intellect worked to winnow the potential locations of the key fragment down further. Amongst the most promising targets was Uranic Lumen Sprawl. The status of the sprawl was a product of Lumen 4's shifting political landscape. Formerly a bastion of the Imperial Creed, it had acrimoniously been ceded to the control of the Metallic and Tech Priests 2 years before the invasion. The slow transfer of holy relics, entombed saints, and stasis caskets of irreplaceable religious nanocrypture was years from completion. Frantic as they were, the ecclesiarchical priests refused to speed up the necessary rituals involved in relocating their treasures. By contrast, the tech priests have wasted no time in co-opting grand basilicas and holy bastions into forged temple annexes and storage chambers, to the fury of the confessors and archprelates. The tech priest had gaudy fresco in lattices of dark iron, mounted macro cannons atop recently vacated tomb complexes, and demolish avenues of stadi to make way for thruming power conduits. The tech priest of Uranic Lumen Sprawl had centralized their strategic command in an incense-filled data sanctum built into the former Bentid Auto Shrine. Fortified with the plaza alloys and haloed in a multi-layered void shield array, the data sanctum was deemed proof against even a land strike from orbit. Embedded bionaric sigil nets and quarterized wards protected it from the arcane attacks of a malignant scrap code that had seen other forged sprawls fall. The tech priests defended their stronghold, and its surrounding sprawl with every efficient strategy they could muster. Forlorn attacks by hundreds of servitors blunted the incursions of hordes of chaos cultists. Hidden reserves at Traxi and Siberus harassed the Iron Warriors' formations, managing to draw some out of position. A front line of Qatari that moved slowly backwards, altering its frontage to minimize casualties, brought Kazaga's war bands into range of ever more guns with every step they took. The Iron Warriors' assault soon lost most of its mortal contingent. Their every strategic lunge was blocked or deflected towards worthless regions of the sprawl, where they were isolated and attacked by packs of assassin constructs. With reluctance, the warband's leading champions reported their lack of progress to Kazaga. The Warpsmith, however, already knew. His cybergic conclave of sorcerers and warpsmiths had detected the Data Sanctum's esoteric emissions, and the Warpsmiths had closely monitored the attack on the Forge sprawl with growing impatience. Every report from the handlers of slave psychers increasingly pointed towards Uranic Lumen sprawl as the most likely location of Abaddon's Key Fragment. And so Czagra had bent his intellect into conquering it should others fail him. Czagra first committed a portion of the reserves held within the Herald of Misery itself. Gunships and drop pods hurtled from launch bays and converted cradle scaffolds towards the points around the sprawl, curtain walls that were away from the failing warband's assaults. Others of his own warband, the Faces of Mending Guard, took a sheltered position before the sprawl's heaviest guns. Now came the second phase of Kazaga's attack, recalled from 3 other offensives around central Valenta. More warbands began fighting their way through the Forge suburbs from separate directions. Then flocks of Helldrake demon engines and squads of Iron Warrior Raptors descended from above to scour the upper reaches of the Spore's Forge spars. Czagra imagined the frantic strategizing within the shielded Data Sanctum. He grudgingly credited the Spore's commanders with managing to hold at bay so many diverse assaults simultaneously. When Kzagra's final blow struck, the tech priest of Uranic Lumen sprawl had no reserves with which to counter it. A large force of Kazaga's Faces of Mendriard, including several squads of his elite bronze-wrought Terminators, hit in a single overwhelming attack. The tech priest's overloaded strategium collapsed, with Czagra taking grim satisfaction as his cyber thieves detected the moment of horror that radiated from the Data Sanctum. Uranic Lumen and Spraw's defense did not last for another hour. The final adjustment. In the battle's aftermath, Kzagra's slave psychers picked through the fire-blackened and gore-spattered ruins. Their handlers reported they were sure the Forge sprawl held the key fragment. All that remained was to unearth the item, wherever it was, from whichever hidden vault or forgotten shrine in which it lay. The Grand Marshal of Ruin had already begun to contemplate the ways in which he would sunder the world utterly when an urgent Vox message reached him. Verno and Mandrax had failed, the loyalist vermin he had ordered. His lieutenants to hunt down were alive. There would be consequences. But first, the error had to be corrected. Vano's message claimed he was convinced the loyalist route would take them to the warp portal. Kzagra calculated the risk of them interfering with his ability to send the key fragment to Abaddon through the portal, then acknowledged the message from Verno's pawn and dispatched several of his own missives to warbands on the surface, and others still within the Herald of Misery. The Warsmith's machine-like mind assessed a dozen ways in which he would see the royalists fail and be humbled. If they were intent on reaching the warp portal, he would be there to welcome them. The Rite of Echoes. Aboard the Herald of Misery, Strike Force Rally had escaped the trap laid by the champions of Warpsmith Czagra. The bloodied Space Marines pushed on through the Ark of Omen towards his warp portal. If they could reach that arcane structure, they might yet complete their mission, but the gambit looked more desperate by the moment. The war portal of the Herald of Misery was located within the carcass of a once mighty Imperial star fort. This crumbling edifice jutted from the Ark's dorsal plane like an ancient palace half drowned in a metal sea. The running battles that have raged within the Ark of Omen since Strike Force, Rally and Boarded now approached the fortress from the levels below. To avoid being trapped, as they had almost been, within the screaming decks, the Loyalists had divided their forces. Liberians Rallian and Bakir led one spearhead, psychic energy shimmering around them. They sprinted along corridors and gantries, pounded up steps, and over the bald, slain bodies of traitors, driving ever closer to their destination. Even as they fought, the two librarians gathered their mental might and practiced the chants of the Rites of Echoes. So they would likely have just one chance to perform it when they reached the Ark's warp portal. They had to succeed, or the consequences for the Imperium itself might be dire. Following came a second force that was assigned the role of rearguard, led by Blood Angel's Lieutenant Leodas. These battle brothers had sworn to hold Vernal the Grey Caribou, Mandrax, and the pursuing war bands at bay, maintaining their fighting retreat even at the cost of their own lives. As the ferocity of the heretics' breakthrough attempts intensified, and Leotis' losses mounted, that price looked likely to be paid in full. Last gasp. Surface of Lumen 4. While battle raged across Lumen 4, victorious Iron Warriors consolidated their position within the Uranic Lumen sprawl. Packs of slave psychers combed the ruins, dragging their handlers behind them. The cursed hybrids converged upon the heart of the sprawl and clawed at the rubble, desperate to plunge into the catacombs below. Down in those crumbling depths, it seemed the key fragment awaited. Yet even as the dark Mechanicum excavator engines gouged the earth and bands of heretics and chosen pushed down through the catacombs, the vengeful wrath of the Loyalists broke against the Iron Warriors. Anew the ground shook beneath the tread of Knights of House Crust, led by the mighty Reaver Titan, Ecclesium Fortis, and supported, albeit somewhat belatedly, by a host of battle sisters. Battle erupted through the ruins of the Uranic Lumen sprawl, as a beleaguered Iron Warrior staged a bitter holding action. The Loyalists, they knew, could not be permitted to prevent the recovery of Abaddon's Key Fragment or Warsmith. Khazara's wrath would be terrible indeed. Fire tore through the smoke-wreathed ruins. Iron Warriors' battle tanks ground over rubble, and corpses trading fire with loping knights and zealous Adeptus Sororitas. Ecclesium Fortis strode through the savagery like a god of war, and with its every pounding footfall, more of the chambers and catons below the ground collapsed upon the increasingly frantic heretic search parties. Even at this hour, it appeared the Iron Warriors, and thus did the Spoiler, would be denied their arcane prize. The third band of loyalists was the smallest, but their duty was vital. We assessed the Coitator network in the Screaming Decks. Tech Marine Chalmo had brought down the force field entrapping Rallian's strike force. While doing so, he had also located a bank of operational savior pods. The escape vessels were situated at the bottom of a mechanical ravine that split a section of the Ark's outer hull, and according to Talmo's data auguries, required an outer bulkhead to be blown and a handful of jutting construction armatures to be cleared from their paths before they could be launched. He had split off from the push towards the warp portal, accompanied by the survivors of Scout Squad Gatello and Infiltrator Squad Titania, to clear this exfiltration route. Whatever the librarians learned in the portal chamber would be useless if they could not escape the Arks of Omen, while the loyalist boarding parties battled towards their objectives. The Ark's master was not idle. Alert to the threat of the warp portal, Warpsmith Czagra had determined to crush the invaders in person. He was free to do so by the report that the key fragment had been secured, issuing commands for the execution of Lumei, for to commence in earnest. The Grand Marshal of Ruin turned away from the surface war, gathered a band of his Aphases of Mendengard, and accompanied by the sorcerer Macrantier, made for the nearest functional launch bay, the Iron Crusade. In the wake of their raid on the Herald of Misery, the Blood Angels and the Tomb Keepers had made good their escape. Some had fled the ship, while others had fallen back into the Ark's perilous depths and dared the Iron Warriors to give chase. Warpsmith Czagra was left to manage the aftermath of this assault upon his flagship and to lay plans for what came next. Though their numbers had been few, and the Herald of Misery was immense by anyone's measure, still the damage the lawyers had caused was considerable. Their ritual had triggered a pulse of empiric energy from the Ark's warp portal that had rippled through the colossal vessel from prow to stern. Its effects had been felt most keenly in the portal chamber, in the form of partial structural collapse, architectural mutations, and a rash of malefic possessions, amongst Kazaka's favored bronze rod. Elsewhere, the warp pulse triggered stranger phenomena. A plague of murderous gists erupt from the sarcophagi of a funeral barge melded deep within the Ark's dorsal crags. Mars of intertwined cables and wires, mutated into sparking serpentine horrors that burst from the walls of multiple vessels to hunt live prey. The rust-hued fungal growth infesting part of the Ark erupted into rapid growth and overran the territories of the Smog Giants and Sunkar God Warb bands. These were but a handful of the bizarre phenomena that racked the Herald of Misery. Warpsmith Czagra's wrath was terrible. He made bloody examples amongst those he held responsible for the royalists' escape. He dispatched malevolent hunters with orders not to return until they had tracked down the interlopers and taken vengeance upon them. He commanded a conclave of warpsmiths and masters of possession to repair the damage done throughout his Ark, threatening dire consequences if they did not meet his punishing schedule. Once he was satisfied that loyalists had not endangered the ultimate survival of his flagship, Czagra's attention shifted. He was above all a being of methodical pragmatism, rising action for. He still had a system-wide war to win. In a mood most unmerciful, the Grand Marshal of Ruin returned to slaughtering a system, iron cold and cruel. Loom died first, those heretic forces not quick enough to reach designated extraction points perished along with it. Czagra directed the fury of every warship had in orbit against the luckless world, and with all 4 of its orbital platforms now scuttled or destroyed, there was no one left to interfere. Kinetic spears, sailing lance beams, and rains of barrage bombs reduced sprawl after sprawl to ruin. With no supporting vessels in orbit, there was nowhere for Imperial evacuation craft to go should they escape the planet's atmosphere. This did not stop many from attempting to flee, but nearly all were cut to pieces by the ruthless gunnery of the Iron Warrior's void ships. Mere hours after Czagra ordered Lumen for put to death, the weapon systems of the Herald of Misery were carving a blazing skull 1,000 miles across into the carcass of a slaughtered world. Conflict 4. The system's other worlds also met cataclysmic conclusions to their suffering at the hands of the Iron Warriors. On Lume 2, thermo-reactive dome shields protected the hive cities from the killing heat of the nearby star. Fanatical cult insurgents serving the Ferocrete creed struck at the shield's macro stanchions and demolished one after another. The shields fell in miles wide, storms of tumbling glass, and the lethal energies of the star swept down in their wake. The crystal-riven mining world of Lume 9, meanwhile, saw its rigs and platforms depopulated by boarding parties of Iron Warriors led by Dark Magos Brewcast. The facilities were stripped of technology and resources, then left as dark charnel houses doomed to be crushed by the planet's endlessly replicating crystal deposits. These peripheral campaigns had barely ended when Czagra commanded his scattered forces to rally to his side. He had begun the invasion of the Lume system with a mighty Bale fleet, but Imperial resistance had been stiff and casualties heavy. There would be much work to do, replenishing Czagra's ranks and rebuilding his fleet before he could wage war on this scale again. Nevertheless, the Grand Marshal of Ruin would not leave Leona Stellarium unconquered in his wake. He also would not countenance another failed assault upon the Void Fort, and he determined to strike with all his remaining strength and crush both the fort and its recently returned defense fleet with a single decisive hammer blow. Extinguished. Mustering such might across interplanetary distances was not swift. By the time Czagra's fleet swept down upon Leona Stellarium, his victims had made best use of the time they had been afforded. The Force astropaths had amassed their mind choir and sent Strike Force Reliance warning racing out along heavily encrypted channels covered by a pair of Musk-class battle cruisers. The Dauntless-class light cruiser Oracle of Thalis had sped from Leona Stellarium and run the chrome pickets of chromite beast warships to escape the system. Aboard it went several Imperial dignitaries considered too important to perish aboard Leona Stellarium and the survivors of Strike Force Rally. These were the only loyalists to leave the Lume system. However, all those who remained had sworn to exact what vengeance they could for the cold-blooded murder of 3 Imperial worlds. Then came Czagra, wielding the might of the Herald of Misery, the surviving vessels of the mighty Bale fleet, and a fearful host of Iron Warriors and their allies. The defiant loyalists fought hard, driven by hatred and faith. Yet their desire for vengeance was as nothing to Kazaga's terrible wrath. Warships of traitors and loyalists alike burned in the void. Comeback 4, the blood-drenched decks of Leona Stellarium, was swept clear of borders once, twice, a third time. And then, when Warpsmith Czagra was sure his foes had been sufficiently worn down, the Herald of Misery swept into the battle with its myriad batteries and esoteric super weapons blazing. Swarms of fighters and bombers billowed from its launch decks. The battle's end came swiftly after that, the Warsmith himself delivering the killing blow with a teleport attack upon the Void Fortress's Strategium decks. So with the final shots in the war for the LUM system fired, the final defenders slain, their bold last stand brought to a bloody end. Rising action, 4 Bastards, Path to Glory. As his Bale fleet cut a sway across Imperial space, Warpsmith Czagra led one military campaign after another. Some conflicts were left to his champions to manage, while others saw squadrons of his Bale fleet vessels ranging far from his ark, only to return with fresh battle scars and plunder. Y-Force 9, Warpsmith Czagra was concluding his campaign in the Ajara system when a demonic envoy of twisted flesh and machinery came before him. The entity represented Vashtor the Arkifane, and it brought word that the Blackened Tower Bale fleet had been plunged into intriguing conflict by an infestation of enslavers, and was no longer able to claim its allotted key fragment. If Czagra completed the mission in their stead, Vashtor would repay him with a legion of specialized demon engines marched fresh from the soul forges. The possibility of such a prize overcame even Kazaga's weariness of demonic machinations. The Grand Marshal of Ruin accepted Vashtor's contract and turned his Bale fleet for Y-Force 9. That world turned out to be colossal, a superplanet gripped by extreme gravity and lent annulled appearance by the thousands of deep chasms splitting its surface. Hydroelect electric shrines harvested the power of the world's torrential rivers and fed it into fortified habdumas, mining complexes, and orbital defense isloes. Unlike Lumei 4, the psychic spore of the key fragment here seems strong and clear. The envoy had provided Czagra with fresh slave Cygers to help him complete his mission, and all now jibed and screamed about the planet's northernmost dome, Complex 13. This then became the Iron Warriors' target. Their planetary assault was swift, savage, and overwhelming. Czagra did not intend to waste longer than he must running errands for demons. Instead, he hurled wave upon wave of assault craft into a landing zone centered around Complex 13, while the Herald of Misery and his accompanying warships unleashed bombardments to stave off the Imperial armored columns racing to reinforce the beleaguered dome. What followed was a ferocious conflict as Iron Warrior siege tanks, Havocs, and Legionaries shattered one fortified defense line after another. The Loyalists fought back with the desperate strength of cornered prey. Their companies of Agrin Auxilia held the city's inner domes despite mounting casualties, while the defense lasers punched several of Czagra's warships out of orbit as flaming wreckage. In the end, however, the wrath of an entire Bale fleet could not be resisted by the defenders of one world. Never mind one city. After the traitor warlord Titan Delirium Overkill shattered the Star Spire Gate, and the Iron Warriors outflanked the last Imperial defense lines. The end came quickly for Complex 13. Word of the invasion had barely even spread to Yavo's 9 southern domes before the planet's key fragment, an ancient space marine helm painted onyx black and crowned with steel wings, was being fed up to the Herald of Misery aboard a Stormbird gunship. So did Warpsmith Czagra secure the might of an entire legion of infernal demon engines. The Bulkhead War. In first conquering the Herald of Misery, Czagra had faced furious opposition by the Orcs of Warboss Grimsag, who very much considered the vessel his, lacking the time or strategic stability to crush the Orcs decisively. The Warsmith had instead driven them back into a sector of the Ark's enormous prow, then ordered them sealed in. The Xenos had staged several violent breakouts since, each one died at considerable cost in lives. With the Herald of Misery's outer decks firmly under his control, and his forces bolstered by recent victories, Czagra elected to crush the Xenos before the Ark threat reached critical mass. The Iron Warriors launched a 3-prong attack through the Hall of Bodies, the Withering Decks, and the mutated wreck of the Titania Apocalypse Ima. Using explosive charges, they demolished the walled walls they had raised to hold the Orcs at bay, blasting them back into enemy territory like enormous frag charges. Elite war bands of Iron Warriors stormed the resultant breaches, intending to steamroller any foes left reeling from the detonations. Instead, they were met head-on by hordes of roaring Xenos pouring over their own blast-shredded dead from every chamber, corridor, and crawlway. In the withered decks, the Iron Warriors were driven back by clanking mobs of meganobs, whose custom blasters and howling kill saws transform even bronze wrote into torn metal and bloody meat. Elsewhere, Iron Warrior Warpsmiths were forced to collapse entire sections of the Titania Apocalypse to stem the tide of death, Skull Orcs pushing them relentlessly back. Only in the Hall of Beasts, where Czagra led the assault, did his forces make swift and bloody headway, purging the Xenos from their breach zone before pushing out to secure the axis shafts of the Tendril and the ransacked industrial decks lining the blackened smog chasm. These vicious brawls were but the opening salvos in a war that proved more brutal and prolonged than even Czagra's most pessimistic predictions. Dork's numbers had swelled alarmingly during their air-forced captivity, and they had stripped mechanical systems throughout the proud decks to fashion an arsenal of ramshackle weapons and armor. Their perishous fungal ecosystem had run riot, even infesting the biochemical extrusions of the Ark's ganglia, where they spread through the region. Battle after battle, the fighting lines of Orcs and Iron Warriors flowed back and forth, until corridors became choked with corpses, and warped predators were drawn from the depths by the gore, flowing shin depth down stairways and ramps. The turning point came amidst ferocious fighting through the teetering undergantries. Warboss Grimsag led a wild charge to shudder the Iron Warriors' lines and drive them from their fighting platforms into the bubbling sump pits below. Even as a massive orc bellowed his victory cry through the echoing chambers, an axe blade clove his head in two from behind, dripping with some filth, his body twisted by fresh mutations. Carbal Mandrax kicked the enormous orc's corpse over the edge of the platform he himself had just clambered up to. Pay off 4! As what horrors the deranged master of executions had faced in the bowels of the Ark since its plummet into the pit, none knew, but the experience seemed only to have rendered him more monstrous. Rallying to their risen champion, the Iron Warriors drove into the now leadless orcs and scattered their strength in every direction. So began a relentless advance that saw Czagra's forces push deep into Xenos territory and recapture deck after deck. The orcs were neither eradicated nor truly defeated, but divided now between the banners of dozens of rival knobs and big bosses. So they broke apart and vanished into other regions of the Ark. The greatest greenskin threat had been neutralized. What factionalized infestations remained, Czagra left to his champions to hunt down, for he considered them beneath his notice. And no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. See you next Friday.